Oh, well, thanks for staying around. Hopefully the next section will be more interesting. Are we on to the next slide? Next presentation? Got a little video on this one as well. Okay, so evolution occurs. Hang on, didn't you just say evolution is impossible? No, we do see evolutionary changes occur. But what we don't see is the evolution of new types of organisms, new body parts, new biochemical functions. And that's the whole essence. This is why this topic is so confusing. This is why people, come on to some of the websites and say all sorts of funny things. Let's try and clarify this a little bit. So essentially Darwin said that there was some ancestor into which life was first breathed, and that over time, as this ancestor reproduced, mutations occurred, and gradually some of those mutations enabled it to survive better. And so, and maybe, environment changed. And over a long period of time, the mutations between these two lines became different enough that they became different species. And so essentially he drew a little pictorial of a tree with a common ancestor down the bottom, showing little branches, which he estimated occurred after about 10,000 generations, and a new species had formed. And that became the tree of life. And I think that little tree diagram enabled people to picture this, yes? A lot of small changes, and then gradually after a while the differences accumulate so that really they're different species. And it all sounds very reasonable. A small child could understand that sort of logic, that small changes, but does it represent what can really happen in terms of DNA and the biology that we know? Let's have a look at this little video. There is a section that is R-rated, so I just apologise for that. Just remember the codes, the DNA for all these processes and components of all these animals, according to Darwin's theory, arose by chance. Amazing photography, eh? Carefully, you'll see a mum with a little suckling bub. see it real well, unfortunately. But that one fox is carrying the baby. Okay, so we saw a lot of diversity of life there. Just as an offhanded comment, you saw a lot of insects there. In the fossil records, insects appear with flight fully developed, no ancestors. Extremely complex. All the code to encode for all those components of the insect are in its DNA and had to have arisen by chance. Random mutations. Just imagine the random mutations that change the process so that you have a little caterpillar, all encoded in the DNA, goes into the cocoon, the chrysalis stage, and then comes out with wings, a reproductive system, an antenna. Just imagine the code for that to happen forming by chance. Just imagine the code for the navigation system in those monarchs. Now, you can have a monarch butterfly. That filming there is in an area about 100 miles, 160 miles northwest of Mexico City in the jungle there, where the monarchs from North America come down and gather. When they fly back in the spring, they go up to north of the USA, southern Canada, and they live on the milkweed. And so you can have a generation that has flown up from Mexico, and they mate, and their offspring grows up and mates, and their offspring grows up and then flies back to Mexico, where it's never been, and its parents have never been. Do you know where your grandparents had their honeymoon? Could you go there? You could look it up, where they had their honeymoon. Okay. So, I don't know what internet the monarch butterflies use, but just think of the navigation system and the program for that navigation system to be able to utilise the sun and the Earth's magnetic field and so forth is programmed into their DNA. How did that arise by chance? Mutations. And let's have a look at the biochemistry. So there are things to think about. Let's go on with the talk though, lest I get to. So all living things in nature are made up of chemical molecules. All living things grow from a seed or an egg, which contains a code to make all the chemical molecules that make up the part of that plant, bird, animal, insect, fish or bacteria, whatever. So we're starting with something that's alive now. This is Darwin's theory. We've got life here. All living things in that video had their own DNA code, own unique code. Each flower had a different code. Each insect had a different code, and so forth. Now, many textbooks assert that these codes came about as mutations in the DNA causing changes in the organism, with certain changes surviving better in nature, theory of evolution. But, in reality, mutations don't produce new codes. Now, this is where people sometimes take me to task, but give me a chance to explain here. They produce, in fact, in medicine, they produce disease. They produce minor changes, not a new body part. We never observe new body parts, totally new biochemical processes. Let me explain it a little bit better. Here we've got a VW car, a Beetle car, and they're produced in a factory by robots. And that robot runs by a computer program. Now, say there's a mistake in the computer program and it leaves off the mudguards and the boot and the bonnet and the doors. We now have a lighter vehicle. And so people could choose that for a dune buggy. And so it's selected for travel over sand. But what we observe is a loss of code. Now, we observe mutations that correspond to that. We observe mutations that correspond to a loss of genetic code. We could have another scenario where in the factory, the robots, by mistake, there's an error in the code and it puts on the wheels from a VW truck and the bumper bar from a VW truck. And so now we have a little Beetle that would be good for going off-road through the bush. Or we may have duplication. The computer program has a hiccup, it repeats, and we have 2 steering wheels put in the car, or something like this. So we have this sort of duplication. Sometimes we can have gene duplication, parts of genes duplicated. But it's pre-existing code that is duplicated. A very common form of, and the form of the one with the bumper bar and the wheels, that commonly occurs in bacteria, for example. We get a transfer of genetic code from one bacteria to another. Matter of fact, our top 10 food poisoning bacteria are a result of transfers of pieces of genetic information for toxins via prions from toxic bacteria into an otherwise harmless bacteria that would survive in us. So we observe these sort of changes. We also observe, say there we have a VW that is a convertible. It comes out of the factory with the top down, but the owner is driving along, starts to rain, he presses a button and the top comes up. Now we have a VW that has a top over it. It's different, it looks different. It would be described as perhaps as a different species. But the code for that was activated by an environmental change. We know, for example, that changes in just physical pressure can switch on and off parts of the DNA code. But the point is that the code was already there for the parts of the hood, for the little electric motor, for all the mechanisms to make it happen. It was just dormant, it wasn't being used. But as soon as the rain came, it was activated. We have lots of examples of evolution like that. Matter of fact, Dawkins talks about that in Evolution is the Greatest Show on Earth with regard to guppies in a pond and them developing colours when predators there. The codes are already there. What we never observe is the VW factory producing an army tank or a helicopter or a microwave oven or an F-18 fighter, right? Why? Because there's no code. There's no code there in the robots for a cannon. There's no code in the robots for army tracks. There's no code for caterpillar tracks. There's no code there for armour plate. But what the Darwin theory says is, well, hang on. It did happen because in the army tank there's a steering wheel, there's a seat, and there's pedals. Right? And it has an engine. So it must have evolved. But it required totally new code. And that's the important point that I want to get across. For these organisms, for a fish to evolve into an amphibian, a reptile into a bird or whatever, you've got to have massive amounts of new code formed by random mutations. We don't observe that happening. Now let's have a look at this. Let's drill down into this a little bit further. Mutations don't add new code. We mostly observe the mutations we observe when chemicals or radiation damage DNA, they don't function anymore. So some of you, and this is an area I work in quite a bit because this is how we produce the new wheat varieties, the new barley varieties, right? You know, many of you use canola oil. Canola oil is oil from rapeseed where part of the code is damaged so it no longer produces the enzyme that produces a particular toxin. Well, some of you might eat the Goodness Power Foods Barley Max cereals. There's made from a barley that was sourced from Tibet that has certain genes switched off and it produces a lot of resistant starch as a result of that. And so these are the sort of things that we observe. they almost always involve the loss of genetic information. Occasionally transfer of existing information, occasionally duplication. Now, Dawkins cites examples. He cites, for example, well, there's these women that have this particular genetic mutation that makes them resistant to HIV. And he says this is a classic example of evolution in action. And sure, those women no longer have produced the transporter molecule that enables the virus to enter the cells. But those women develop liver disease and die from liver disease. And this is what we find. Sometimes they argue, oh, yes, a beneficial mutation. But in almost all those cases, like sickle cell anemia, but they also always results in disease. And that's what we observe in medicine. There are over 10,000 diseases in medicine listed as a result of genetic mutations in our DNA code. Mutations produce disease. They don't produce new organisms. Matter of fact, what was that? 90% of all mutations that every person has in their bodies do nothing. Okay. Okay. No, okay. They don't all produce disease, but they can produce disease or do nothing because we have DNA repair mechanisms. And that's the other side of, which is again, which I'll talk about in a little bit, in another slide. So here we look again at the DNA, just a schematic diagram to remind us of it and our replication that we had there. And so here, for example, we might have the code for a bone cell, or the code for a pancreas cell on a chromosome, brain cell, and so forth. But we can get mutations. We can get mismatch, we can get deletions, we can get repetitions, and so forth. And what happens then, of course, when this occurs in the code, that this mistake in the code can go in to the ribosome, and what we happen then is a mistake in the amino acid that is produced, and a mistake in the proteins. So a lot of the time, and one of the reasons why you can't marry hopefully a very close relative, is that when the two chromosomes come together, if there is a mutation in one of those chromosomes or damage, hopefully in the other gamete cell from the other partner, that same corresponding mutation won't be there. So the DNA corrects itself. Beg your pardon? What did I say? If something goes wrong, it's a mutation, yes. I'm not understanding your question. Well, that's a mistake. That's damage to the code. The design itself is very good, just like the computer program in the VW factory. But things can then go wrong. Environmental things can go wrong. We can answer that question later. So this is how hereditary mutations occur. And we can see from there, from the diagram, that if a mutation occurs, it occurs in the fertilised egg, and it can be carried on, and then it can lead to a mutation either somewhere in the organism, reproductive system. And so we can see that these are passed on to the offspring. Now, what the claims of evolution are, that these mutations eventually, over time, add up to some advantage and some new type of organism. What I argue is, and I agree with you, that a lot of the time there's repair mechanisms to say there's no effect whatsoever because there's so many backup systems in the situation. But that's not evolution. That's just homeostasis, remaining the same. Beg your pardon? Well, some mutations have no effect, but some mutations produce disease. What I'm arguing is that no... Okay. But my point is that mutations don't produce new code. Significant amounts of new code. Yes, but the new codes don't work. They don't produce significant new code that can lead to the arising of some new organism. No, what I said was, okay, just hang on. What I said was, in the case of the guppies, was an example of pre-existing code that was switched on as a result of environmental pressures. Because the research tells us that. Those genes for colour are already encoded in the DNA. I'll answer the questions maybe at the end, otherwise we'll take too long in the presentation. Mutations involve changes to the molecular structure of DNA. These changes involve the laws of chemistry and physics, which are fixed and do not encode information or new design. New information in a code produces a new design, requires an intelligent mind or a programmer. So what I'm saying is you can change the code, and I agree with you, either it'll do nothing or it'll damage the code. You're not going to have enough mutations to produce enough new, meaningful code where the organism can survive. So the probability, philosophically, of impossibility is defined as a probability is less than 1 to the power 10 to the 150. The probability of one small gene forming by chance is less than 1 in 10 to the power 190. So it's impossible for the genetic code for just one gene to form by chance. Now, many students think that scientists know how life on Earth evolved, but in reality scientists do not know. For example, the UC Museum, University of California Museum of Paleontology, Berkeley, Evolution 101's website states biologists are trying to figure out how evolution happens, and that's not an easy job. Goes on to say, one of the questions that evolutionary biologists are trying to answer is how does evolution produce new and complex features? And that's the point. How do these mutations produce new and complex features? So that's one of the world's top universities. On their website, you can go there. That's what they're saying. That at the present time, there's no known mechanism whereby the new code for a new type of organism could form.
That's the question at the start of their learning tool. It's used as a learning introduction. It's in the question, how does this happen? And then they explain it.
That's not true. Let's go on. You look up the website and see. There's standard mechanisms. There's still no known mechanism for how evolution occurs. Let me continue. The formation of substantial amounts of new code to produce new and complex features is fundamental for evolution to occur. Without it, evolution is without foundation. But to date, no experiments have demonstrated a possible mechanism. So, for example, look at Lenski. Lenski bred E. coli through, it's now up to over 50,000 generations. No significant new genetic code was observed to form. After 30,000, it was trivial. And this is where we get into a debate. It was trivial. Let's have a look. Lenski's team discovered that the only major change was the bacteria could now use citrate as a food. And if you look at this paper here, it explains that a recombination sequencing reveals a refinement step in the evolution of metabolic innovation. E. coli in the wild metabolize citrate. So what happened was there was a duplication of a gene that activated a pre-existing gene that was already there to use citrate as food. Well, check the reference. That's why I put it up there. And secondly, this is the only example that Dawkins can cite in his book Evolution, the Greatest Show on Earth, as an example of new information arising. This is the only example. After 50,000 generations, there's still E. coli. They're not even a new genus. So this is the only experiment that he can cite. And if you look at the subsequent analysis, if you look up that reference, go and Google it now. There it is. Look up that paper, which is discussion papers on this that show that it's not significant new code. It was the upregulation by a mistake of pre-existing code. Yeah, a mutation.
So it wasn't pre-existing, it was mutated?
No, there was a pre-existing code that was dormant, not activated. A mutation activated it. What I'm saying is it's not new code that is forming. Look, let's continue on, okay? You've got it there. There we got the E. coli bacteria. After 60,000 generations, they were still E. coli. They had not even evolved into a different species of bacteria, let alone a more complex organism. Instead, a duplication of a CT gene next to a promoter which controls another gene, but now switched on the CYP2 gene, had enabled the bacteria to use citrate as a food. The CYP2 gene was already there. And this is where this argument gets, very detailed and complex and pedantic. Some people argue about this nylon-eating bacteria that they say was evolved. It's another example because nylon's a synthetic molecule. But again, investigations into that show that it was a pre-existing enzyme that just happened to have that capability. All the examples of observed evolution in textbooks, the organisms remain the same. There might be a change in colour or wing size or beak shape, but it's still the same type of organism. The moths stay moths, the mice stay mice, the fruit flies stay fruit flies, the bacteria remain bacteria. So here we've got some of the classic examples that are given of the evolution of moths and wingless beetles and so forth. But let's consider how much new code has to form to make a new species. Okay, so here we've got a single cell organism. An E. coli bacteria has about 4.5 million DNA base pairs. A brewer's yeast cell has 12 million base pairs. So we need, for a bacteria to evolve into a yeast, 7.5 million new pieces of code have to form. Because it's not true. There's no evidence of that. That's your theory. Okay, let me finish. You still have to have a code. Where that code comes from, whether it's your common ancestor or not, it still requires new code. All those 7.5 million pieces of new code have to form by chance and they have to be perfect or it won't work. And there's your yeast cell. When we go to a worm, when we go to a nematode, we say that eventually a worm evolved, right? Our worm, our little nematode here, the code for that has 95 million base pairs. So for our organism to evolve from our simplest organism, where did the 95 million new pieces of code come from? No. You've got 600 million years at most. Okay? Well, we can do the calculations on that. I deal with that as well. But we have no mechanism. Mutations don't produce new code. You've bred E. coli through 50,000 generations and they're still E. coli. How many generations to evolve into a worm? Yeah. I know, it might be, but that's not what the common public understand what Darwin is talking about. What Darwin is talking about is a fish evolving into an amphibian into a reptile into a bird. I understand that, but what I'm saying is those small mutations don't produce new code. Yeah, okay, look, I see what you're saying. But how does it produce new code for an army tank? How does it produce new code for armour plate? No. You can't write a new program for a new cannon or a new armour plate or new code. I did train as a computer programmer years ago, 1966. Okay. All right. Let's look at the evidence. So again, we've talked about the worm. So you have to produce massive amounts of new code by mutations, but we don't see mutations, observe them producing substantial amounts of new code. We don't observe that. What we do is we observe very, very tiny changes that remain in the same type of organism.
So once that tiny change happens, can it mutate again? Is it possible for that tiny change to mutate again and change again?
within the constraints of the organism. But this is it. It doesn't move outside the biological constraints. And we also have discovered that there are constraints on the major components of the code that actually stop them mutating, or they just fail altogether. If you read some of the papers that have just come out in the last 12 months in Nature. So a mouse has about 2.5 million base pairs. So that's 2.5 million pieces of new code. And that's just one mammal. According to evolution, all this coordinated, perfectly new code has to arise by these chance mutations. But we know that the probability of a successful gene just forming by chance is greater than impossible, greater than power of the 10 to the 190. And a mouse is just one of 5,000 or more mammals. And so when we look at all the different species that we have, all these different codes have to all arise by your chance mutations, and we haven't even observed one new creature forming. If we have approximately 100 to 200 million new creatures that have formed over the last 600 million years since the Cambrian, which is the estimate, then we would expect to see a new creature forming every 3 years. We should be able to easily reproduce it in the laboratory with fruit flies or with bacteria, but we don't. The Permian extinction? No, because when we go back the oldest fossils are approximately 600 million years old, according to radiometric dating. Okay, let's continue on here. You need to show me those papers. Yeah, I've been there. Okay, that's not correct. Anyway, let's go on here. What we have here is the number of different species. So at the moment, we can see a massive amount there. I've listed here about 1 million species of the ones that we know. Overall, there were, in 2009, nearly 1.9 million known species. All these species have to have new codes. All these codes have to arise by chance. So if we look back 600 million years to the Cambrian, if you want to say there's life older than that, then fair enough. But the substantial amount of life forms from the Cambrian on. So all the evolution of most of these species has evolved in the last 600 million years. So you've got a massive amount of new code. If you take all these species and all the amounts of code that you've got trillions upon trillions upon trillions of new pieces of code in the DNA code. Nowhere near enough time. We can't observe new code. We don't observe a fruit fly evolving into anything else. We don't observe a bacteria evolving into anything else. No one has ever observed that. Similarity doesn't mean a thing if you don't have a mechanism that can explain it, and you don't have a mechanism. Well, you see the difference in the organisms around that I just showed. They're vastly different. Vastly different. You know, our digestional system. The point is that the code can't arise by chance. That's the point. Okay, let's keep going on this talk. It's estimated that, so there I have, that we can expect all these codes, hundreds of millions of codes, have to arise by chance. And we know it's impossible, absolutely impossible. Instead, what we observe is the extinction of codes. We observe the different codes becoming extinct. That's why we go into rainforests, to try and find stuff that hasn't become extinct. What we observe in the world is not evolution, we observe extinction. We observe that in the fossil record as well. And this is where I say, if on the average we would expect to see see a new species every 3 to 6 years, and yet over thousands of years no one has seen a new species evolve. Instead, the opposite is thousands of species have become extinct. E.O. Wilson is an evolutionist at Harvard Uni, professor of biology at Harvard, and specialised in insects. What we observe is the opposite to evolution. We observe the loss of code everywhere, all the time. We don't observe new code forming, we observe the loss. That's what we actually measure today. We observe the loss of code occurring everywhere, not evolution. We observe disease increasing, we observe and here's another side of the mutation story. The DNA system has built-in mechanisms to preserve the code and repair it, which again is preserving it against any major evolutionary forms. Sure, we can see some forms of speciation occurring with just minor changes in the code, but not change to a new type of organism. There's no known explanation for the evolution of a new type of body part, given all your means of change, because you think about it. To evolve for that fish fin that Dawkins talks about in his book, The Fish in a Drought, and the fish that was able to crawl over the next pond survived, you think of the changes that have to occur for a fin to evolve into a leg. For a leg to work, you have to have a hip system or a shoulder blade system. You have to have codes for the muscles. You have to have codes for the bones. You have to have codes for the unique surfaces of the bones on their joints that are made up of all different cells, and the nerve systems and the blood supply systems. The codes for all these components have to form new. To say that they just form by small changes has never been observed, and there's no known mechanism where small changes can produce intelligent code.
You outlined them before.
I observe small changes. Most of those small changes cause harm because they disrupt the code, or else they don't work. Yeah, some of them do nothing, or they disrupt the code.
Because they do nothing, they stay dormant and they accumulate until all of a sudden enough mutations have changed that organism just the right way, just mere minuscule steps to be able
The problem is that DNA repairs itself. So once it detects a mutation, it repairs.
But you just said that the E. coli turned on an old mutation. Something else that you can...
No. I said it turned on a pre-existing gene that was turned off
And how did the gene turn back on?
through a mutation. That gene, that
So you're talking in circles.
just
You're saying mutations exist, but they can't continue to exist because they can't continue to exist.
you're missing. Let me clarify myself again. With that mutation there was existing code to utilise gene. There was a gene that was switching off that code in that particular strain of E. coli. There was then a mutation that damaged the switching off mechanism, which now enabled the original code to be activated.
No, that wasn't damaging the code. Actually, that it was shown that it was a reactivation, not a destruction.
It was the destruction of the code that was switching it off, which now meant that it was
Activation.
These mutations are mediated by the environment. With this whole discussion that you've had tonight, you've not mentioned the environment.
I did mention the environment. I
You
mentioned
mentioned
that.
it once. Can I finish, please?
Okay, yeah.
The whole point of this is that genes are... so that evolution is the change in genes in a population, and that is passive to the environment. That means that as the environment changes, the genetic population changes with the environment, and this happens over generations.
Okay.
Giving the exact mechanism that you just mentioned, and you're saying that we don't know
But
the
it's all
mechanism,
pre-existing code. The point is that it doesn't develop into new code. Now, you say that mutations can accumulate. You've got to have a massive amount of mutations to go from, as I said, a yeast cell to a worm. You've got a massive amount of mutations to accumulate, and and for them to be sustainable. What I'm saying is this: when we go out and observe, no one has observed a totally new type of body part or something like this observing. We don't observe the bacteria evolving into even a new genus of bacteria, and bacteria turn over very quickly. There's no known observations of new types of organisms forming, and this is where the debate comes. You claim that these smaller changes can produce the larger changes, but there's no evidence of that, and I claim that on the basis of mathematics, on the basis of observed science, it's impossible and it's never been observed. I also claim that there's no known mechanism and that the top evolutionists recognise this, and this is what's talked about. Listen, look, the top evolutionists, you've got, for example, the article that was written by the guy from Rutgers University, I think of his name, but it was labelled Why Pigs Don't Have Wings. Right? And that led to the major conference, because what they're saying is no one knows how new types of animals form. That's what that statement on UC Berkeley was about. And you claim that it wasn't, but you read the article and the top research that is around at the present time. They don't know how new structures can form. There's no known mechanism.
Why is evolution still a scientific field?
Yeah.
You say that they don't know. Okay, fair enough. We don't know. But you're saying that's impossible.
I'm saying it's impossible on the basis of biochemistry that we know at the present time, on the rate at which mutations occur and on the rate at which chemical reactions occur. So mathematically we can say for the combination of molecules to occur to produce that code, which is a very complex code, it's a very big code, it has to be in just the right order for it to work pretty well, and for those massive codes to form, the probability of those atoms coming together to form those molecules is so astronomically as to be absolutely impossible. So the powers are sort of like 10 to the power 5,000 and these sort of things when we do the calculations. Because even if we just look at the 2 million species that we know, each of those species have different codes, but substantially different codes, not different by 1,000, codons or this sort of thing, but they're different by millions of codons. And so this is where you've got vast amounts of new code have to be produced somehow by these random mutations. And you can get lots of mutations. There can be mutations that form that are absolutely deadly to the organism. And so none of those have to occur, otherwise the organism gets wiped out. There's nowhere near enough time for evolution to occur. But we haven't yet discussed the radiometric and the age of the Earth question as well. There's a whole lot of inconsistent data here, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Well, life on Earth was nowhere near enough change. It seems a long time to us. As I said, you've got bacteria in the laboratory that turn over every 30 minutes. We've bred them through 50,000 generations and they're still the same. What are you going to have a problem with elephants and alligators and crocodiles and all these things? you just don't have enough time for all these things. Plus, when we look in the fossil record, there's no, I talked about flight. Flight is extremely complex, massively complex codes to produce all the flight mechanisms in the different types of insects and birds and so forth. In insects, fully formed flight insects appear just suddenly in the fossil record. So, and there's lots of examples of this. So the fossil record doesn't provide any answers to these things. So this is another thing that we say. What we observe as extinction is loss of code. That's why, as I said, CSIRO scientists grabbed some barley from Tibet to produce barley max. We're losing code at a massive rate. We're not producing new code. Evolution requires new code to form. Instead, new code is disappearing, becoming extinct, and has become extinct in the past. So the fossil record is a record of extinction of fully formed animals, not a record of animals slowly changing, and I'll talk about that more in the next presentation. In the fossil record, the fossils of animals and plants stay the same from the time they first appear in the lower strata until the time they last appear in the higher strata. So we don't see evolutionary changes in the fossil record itself. What I can say is that some of the world's leading paleontologists agree that there's no evidence of evolution in the fossil record. It's disproven over and over again now from the point of view of biochemistry. It's absolutely impossible. No, hang on. Normal evolution is a chemical process. Normal evolution is chemical. You're relying on mutations. Mutations are chemical processes. These chemical processes are random, right? They don't produce new code. The chances of them producing new code, and you said the mutations accumulate, the mutations will either accumulate till the organism dies, right? Or they just disappear themselves. They don't accumulate to the point of producing a new functional organism. There's no evidence that that can happen. There's no evidence that they can survive that long. And there's no evidence that they can produce a more complex organism. That's the whole point of saying... So let's have a look at this. Let me talk about the fossil record in the next session tomorrow night, and we'll answer that question. The bottom line from biochemistry in the fossil record is that evolution is impossible and never happened. We don't have a record of evolution in the fossil record. We just have a record of fully formed creatures that lived and died. We don't have a record of creatures changing. I don't agree that the world's 600 million years old. The continents would erode away in less than 10 million years. You'd need more than continental drift. You'd need massive continental upthrust, and you'd have... Yeah, anyway, I'll talk about that tomorrow. Yep. Yep, my daughter has climbed Mount Mira right next to it and seen the fossils in the strata. Yeah, okay, and we know we have a rough idea tomorrow. I'll give you some astronomical data calculated by a leading Australian astronomer who led the expedition that first verified Einstein's theory that light was affected by gravity, and his calculations showing that those major upheavals in the plates occurred about 2,500 BC. And the astronomical data is there. A lot of new stuff tomorrow. And I work with the best data there is. And all the things that I've talked about tonight are in the peer-reviewed literature. And if you look on my book, if you go on to Facebook, Evolution Impossible, I cite most of the websites to the peer-reviewed literature supporting what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that you have the top biologists in the world saying that there is no known mechanism whereby new, meaningful, substantial amounts of code can form that would lead to new types of organisms. I work with scientists in this area all the time. And when I talk to these scientists, none of them know of mechanisms of how evolution occurs. They're working in their narrow area. They're not working with evolutionary biology that results in the formation of a new species. What they're working with is the changes that are produced by the losses of genetic code mainly. And they're working in that narrow area. They don't know what is going on in the big picture. In terms of the big picture researchers, the big picture researchers are saying that there are major problems. They're saying they don't have an answer. Look at Thomas Nagel, for example, and what he's saying is we need to listen to these intelligent design people because evolution is impossible. So he's an evolutionist, okay? So, and we substantiate. He puts the arguments out. Read his book, Mind and the Cosmos, Why Neo-Darwinian Evolution Must Ultimately Be Proved to Be False. Read my book. Look at the references. Read what the leading scientists are saying. So, tomorrow we'll look at the evidence from a global flood from the fossil record, the evidence from radiometric dating and other recent discoveries that show that life on Earth can only be thousands of years old. So come along tomorrow and challenge my research there. But I'm happy to answer questions now. But anyway, thank you. That's the end of the talk there.
Yeah, that wasn't actually question and answer time. We are now going to have question and answer time for those that were confused during that presentation. So Dan, if you want to come up, and we've got a number of questions that have come in, and I'll allow Dan to ask these questions due to the use of words I don't understand, and then yeah, you can respond.
All right. So we've got questions from 3 different people, but it looks like there's about 10 different questions. So we'll start with we'll make sure we cover the 3 different sources, and we might have to pull up with all the questions from the one set of handwriting. So here we go. Is it possible that the first life could have been simpler than a cell?
Well, I guess it depends what you call life. some self-replicating mechanism that can undergo evolution is the NASA definition. So essentially NASA assumes that evolution is a fact, and that's how they define life. So what we know about the replication system is that it's extremely complex, and you need the code for that complexity to already be encoded in the first code and the first reading mechanisms, plus the factories to form there. So I think intuitively it's impossible, mathematically it's impossible, in terms of probability calculations and defining impossible as being a chance of less than 1 in 10 to the power 150.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll use this mic.
Oh, is this mic on?
Yeah, it's on.
Cool.
It's got
All right.
yellow
Good.
red light.
Okay. This question: I think it is possible to deny evolution, but how can we know where we are coming from?
Yeah, well, that's one of the big questions I guess we have to ask. How can we know? And that's an area that I'm very interested in. So are there other space-time systems other than our own? Can they communicate with us? I think that there is certainly evidence of the spiritual realm existing, forces of good and evil. There's a lot of interesting phenomena that has been reported in the scientific literature, such as precognition, for example, seeing events in detail ahead of time. There's a great literature of answers to prayer, of miraculous interventions. So this literature is so large that it would suggest that there's a very strong basis to it. So on that basis we can say, well, the evidence points, in my view, to an intelligent designer. We saw the video earlier on of the complexity of the system, and we know from the writing of computer programs and this sort of thing, it takes really intelligent people to write some of these really smart programs and to understand, and that we can't, for example, write a new DNA code to make a lung for a fish, or to make an extra, put a wing on a fish or something like that. We can't write the code. We can't write new codes that make things work. Otherwise, there would be a tremendous breakthrough in medicine. We could write a new code for a person to grow a new liver, this sort of thing. Or we can't design a new chemistry. So there's got to be a super intelligence behind the design of all the amazing reproductive systems, immune systems, and this sort of thing that we see. It's just, the amount of information encoded there is just so huge that, to me, it's absolutely ridiculous to think that it can arise by just random chances, no matter how long it takes. Yeah.
Cool. All right, now we're into a set of questions from one set of handwriting, if I can read handwriting correctly. First one: what is the hydrophobic effect and its relation to entropy, water, and lipids?
Okay, well, when you have so most of the theories for the origin of the first life have these long polymer molecules are forming in water, because water is the common substances here. It enables mobility of the molecules to come together. But according to Le Chatelier's principle, you have a reaction whereby you have two smaller molecules joined together and combine and produce water as a result of the reaction. But it's in an environment of water. So Le Chatelier's principle says that thermodynamically that reaction is driven back the other way. And that's why we see long-chain polymers over time break down in aqueous solutions. And so for long-chain molecules to polymer... Beg your pardon? They can come together as physical molecules, but they don't combine chemically. Right? You need to form new chemical bonds. And that new chemical bond is formed by the removal of water. That's how those long chains are formed. Well, I'm not wrong there. I taught chemistry for years and studied chemistry. That's Le Chatelier's principle. That's how these polymers are formed. I don't know what you've learned. But you've got to form a new chemical compound, form a chain. They can bond next to one another due to your van der Waals forces and so forth and coalesce. But that's not chemical bonding. For chemical bonding to form the new chain, hundreds of thousands long, you have to remove the water molecule and you have a chemical bonding. Well, it depends. You can have exothermic and endothermic reactions. Not in the presence of excess water. It drives the reaction the other way.
But ignoring that part, that fallacy,
Yeah.
the sun, you know, that large ball of energy.
Let's go on to the next question.
Yeah, I think we might have.
And I'm
your
happy to
next
talk
question
with you
here.
afterwards.
So, is this your next question? The sun. How does the sun factor into the second law of thermodynamics? Is that your next question?
Well, I don't see the relevance to our talk. What you're talking about is the sun is the source of energy and that energy can produce information. That theory's been disproven. And the paper published is by Andrew McIntosh, a DSc professor at the University of Leeds. It was published last year or the year before. Paul Davies agrees. Energy cannot produce information. Yeah, energy can't produce information. That was believed. This is the thing that has attempted to save the evolutionary mechanism. But energy doesn't produce information. There's no information encoded in the laws of physics, no information encoded in the energy from the sun in terms of designing plants. The energy from the sun is white information, or the microwave energy or whatever is encoded, it's just white. It's just random.
All right, the next question. Can you explain the relationship between a modern cell and a primitive cell that hasn't had the benefit of 3.8 billion years of evolution?
No, I can't explain.
Next
I don't
question.
know whether there's, I mean, you assume that the cell is that old. What proof do you have that it's that old? I don't have to argue. I don't have to buy into that. Yeah, scientists have speculated that, I've read that stuff. Scientists have speculated that the first reproducing system may have been simpler. But that's speculation. We have no fossils of it. We have no record of it. Oh, the stromatolites sort of thing. Look, there's doubt even whether or not they are even fossils, okay? So, let's not go there. That's a separate argument again. When we're looking at life, when you have to produce life, a living organism, you saw by that mechanism there of how DNA is produced by, Melbourne University. It's very complex.
You don't see the problem here? You're saying this modern cell is naturally just too complex.
Well, that's what we observe. Have you seen any of these older cells? No, it's pure speculation. Let's talk about what we can know and measure today. Well, I have nothing to answer because I disagree with you that the cells were different back then. We don't know how different they were. We don't have them.
I think we
The
might.
cyanobacteria that are supposed to be the fossils that make up those stromatolites in Western Australia, there's debate over that. But those cyanobacteria are still heaps more complex. They've still got hundreds of genes in them. We have them today, your blue-green algae. So, they exist today. I can't see the point of your question. They're still very complex today. Blue-green algae is still very complex. Cyanobacteria. Okay, but how were they dated? Okay, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. There's too many assumptions in this. Let's work on what we can know.
All right, I think we might be able to get through all these questions. Can you show the evidence for Darwin's theory of abiogenesis? There's a couple of words there that I can't read at all, but they're small words.
Darwin's
it's
theory. Well,
very
Darwin
messy.
just didn't know how life first started. He just writes, and I think it's phrased something like this from memory, the original ancestor into which life was first breathed. That's more or less the words of Darwin as I recorded reading them, but it's been a while since I read them.
All right, and I think an easy question to finish on. Can God create a rock so heavy he cannot lift it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. No, because he could always choose to lift it if he wanted to. Yeah. I think we'll talk about some interesting things. I didn't want to get into creation, I just wanted to talk about this, but I can talk about creation at the end of the program tomorrow, some very interesting creation theories that can serve as alternatives.